Is your food making you sick? You might be shocked to learn over 355,000 Australians have coeliac disease. Gluten makes them horribly sick, and while some people have jumped on the idea they'll feel better eating gluten-free as a kind of lifestyle thing, true coeliacs don't have a choice. Like our first guest, Jenni Erbel, who just happens to be married to that lovely bloke you hear at the start and end of our podcast, Col Mooney.
And to help us understand a little bit more about coeliacs, on the line we have Jenni Erbel. G'day, Jenni. Welcome to Food, Wine, Pets Travel.
Hi, how are you?
Good, thanks, Jenni. Now, what we want to find out about is a condition that you have called coeliac disease. What is it? How do you get it? Fill us in.
Sure. It basically means that I suppose I'm allergic to gluten. That's probably the easiest thing is, lots of people have allergies. My allergy is around gluten. My body doesn't like it.
What happens if you have gluten?
Well, for a lot of people, they get a lot of different, I suppose, side effects. My side effect is I actually have a feeling of being hungover for about 5 days.
Oh, no.
With a lot of headache. Without the fun part. So most of the time people tend to throw up or have diarrhea or have bloating. There's even some people that are asymptomatic. So they actually have no symptoms at all, but in my case, that tends to be mine. That feeling of being unwell and you wake up and go, I feel dusty and vague and headachy, that's my thing. So it's an allergy to gluten.
How do most people, including yourself, actually find out they've got this problem?
I believe most people who have the situation where they've got the diarrhea and they're throwing up tend to be easily diagnosed. In my case, mine was very vague. So how I got discovered is there actually is a blood test you can do, and you can also have an endoscopy in order to diagnose. So the little camera that goes down the throat and ends up in your stomach. So mine was a bit unusual because the symptoms were so vague. So it took 3 years from when I started feeling unwell before I actually got diagnosed with it. So it wasn't a good thing at all, but it's a fairly, they say, common disease. They think about 10% of people in Australia actually are coeliacs. It's just how many of them are diagnosed.
And yet there are so many people affected by it. I mean, how do you get it? Do you catch it? Are you born with it?
That's a really good question. I asked the doctor the same thing. And in my family, there's a number of autoimmune diseases. My doctor believes that it's because the modified wheat has actually been the trigger for it. So both of my kids have been tested if they are coeliac, and they've both come back as a negative. I also lived on a cane farm where they used to, in the good old 1960s and the early 1970s, used to spray with a lot of chemicals that are no longer able to be sprayed. And there has been some connection that I understand to people that have been diagnosed with auto disease, and this is a consequence. So whilst I'm not a doctor, it does appear to be there's a genetic link in my family, and we've also been exposed to circumstances, both chemically as well as via diet, that not sure which one was the trigger, but they're all present.
Well, because we're talking to lots of people who are travelling, maybe people who aren't, but what happens when you want to go out and have something to eat, go to a restaurant?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. I must admit at the beginning, that's probably the hardest thing of just being brave enough to go out. I actually went out for dinner last night. You know the restaurants that most of the food is gluten-free, and that's Indian and Thai. When I do go out, even if it's to an Indian or Thai restaurant, as I did last night, it's always letting the restaurant know that you're a coeliac. I need something that's gluten-free, and checking that there's been no contamination as well. So a lot of menus will actually show you what is gluten-free, which is great, but I'll always ask the question. For example, chips in a lot of places is gluten-free, and this is hot chips, not potato chips. I'll ask the question, when you're frying those chips, are you frying them in a special area that only the things that get fried in there actually are gluten-free? So you ask about, is the meal gluten-free, and then you ask around, is there any, I suppose, what's the chance of contamination from it being cooked with other things that actually have gluten as well? For people that are listening, there's nothing wrong with fruit, vegetables, any sort of meat. The issue becomes around things that are in cans, things that are sauces, and obviously breads.
Actually, before we met you, I was told by your husband that you're coeliac, so I popped into the supermarket and grabbed a whole heap of gluten-free bickies and treats and things. I couldn't believe how much more expensive they are.
Yeah, and you're right, Kate. It's not that it's a problem, but if you go there looking for gluten-free, yes, it's expensive. The bread is expensive. In a lot of cases, the gluten-free food that's marketed as gluten-free can also be high in sugar and high in fat in order to make it tasty. So sometimes, I mean, it's the ultimate insult. As my grandson says, sucks to be you. It's like, great, I've paid all this extra for something I actually don't like, and it's awful. Or I'm going to get fat. And the doctor actually said to me after being diagnosed, said, you've really got to watch your diet now, because if all you do is buy everything gluten-free, you're going to put weight on because it's generally highly processed. So it's sort of finding the mid-range of what's healthy, what's obviously all got to be gluten-free, and how do I still have little treats but see them as treats. And how do I change, which essentially is a new regime for eating, and not focusing on packaged gluten-free, actually focusing on unprocessed gluten-free most of the time.
So what do you got to deal with as a celiac? What are some of the issues on a day-to-day basis?
So what I generally do is if we're going out, I'll always have something in my bag that's gluten-free, because you can never guarantee that you can be somewhere where maybe I'm going to be provided for, if that makes sense. So I've always got a supply. That way I know there's not an issue. And it tends to either be a piece of fruit or it's something that's highly processed, which is fine. But most of the time, the focus I have is on eating just, it sounds boring, really healthy, meat, fruit, vegetables, and trying to cut down on processed things.
Yep.
And it works.
Well, in doing a bit of research before our chat, I went looking online and found coeliac.org.au, spelled C-O-E-L-I-A-C. But the name is spelled different ways in different places.
Yes, and it's funny when I saw the name celiac, I looked it up because I always thought it had the O in it. But when you look online, it's actually got the two different sorts of spelling of it. So I learned something too, going, there's two ways of spelling celiac.
So that's where people can go and get more information if they think they might be a celiac. It's good to know you're not alone.
Exactly right. They also have a really good app that has every ingredient and every preservative. So one of the ways initially when I was a celiac was you'd look at something and it doesn't say it on the packet, and you look through every ingredient. Well, they've got a marvellous little app that you can look up every ingredient and every number of preservative to then be able to ascertain yourself by reading the actual ingredients whether which you're actually buying is gluten-free. And that was probably the best thing ever, was getting that app so that I felt empowered when I was out going shopping, especially as a new celiac.
Awesome. Thanks very much for joining us today on Food, Wine, Pets, Travel. I've learnt a lot, and I think everyone else has too.
Oh, absolutely. Look, I was just going to say very quickly, our Healthy Lifestyles Australia dietitian, nutritionist Caitlin Henderson would be very impressed hearing you talk about, you got to eat veggies and fruit and all this sort of stuff. I think that's great.
No doubt, but I've got to say, and I say to my husband quite often, I know I'd eat a lot better because I'm diagnosed as a celiac, because it takes away the choice of eating a whole lot of things I would have eaten. And because I don't have a choice in it, it's easy to comply, because it's a fairly much if I cross the line, I'm going to get whacked.
Yeah, it's a little bit like that in this house, or caravan, I should say.
Yes, yeah. But that's a good thing. You've got to look for the silver lining.
Exactly.
That's important. You've got to do it.
Wonderful. And we hope you can join us again and tell us even more.
Excellent. Well, thanks a lot. I've enjoyed the chat.
You want more podcasts like this? Just go to foodwinepetstravel.com.